Donald Trump is losing control, not because of protests in the streets, but because Republican senators, the very people who once stood behind him, have turned their backs in a vote with potentially decisive consequences. The U.S. Senate, by a 52-47 margin, passed a resolution under the War Powers Act that bars the president from continuing to expand military action in Venezuela without congressional approval. The point is not the number, the point is this: it was a bipartisan vote, and that is what truly pushed Trump out of control, and that is what enraged Trump. He immediately attacked the Republican senators who dared to vote with Democrats, calling them traitors, urging voters to never elect them again, and declaring the War Powers Act unconstitutional, an infringement on the president's commander-in-chief authority under Article 2 of the Constitution. In Trump's logic, anyone who limits his power is an enemy, even someone from his own party. Trump has been blunt in press briefings and public remarks.
Venezuela unilaterally seized and sold American oil industry, massive oil, Venezuelan oil, to rebuild the oil infrastructure, the oil companies. We're going to get the oil flowing the way it should be. They stole our oil.
This is about oil, about resources, about Venezuela's national assets. He has even said the U.S. could be there for many years, a familiar phrase whenever America is on the verge of getting bogged down. That is what has begun to worry many Republican senators, not because they suddenly became anti-war, but because they see a familiar pattern: Iraq. A war that began with vague justifications, continued with constantly shifting objectives, and ended in a quagmire that lasted for decades. In 2003, the U.S. entered Iraq with arguments that seemed clear-cut: weapons of mass destruction, national security, and a campaign marketed as swift and decisive. But after the bombs fell silent, no weapons of mass destruction were found. Instead came a war that dragged on for nearly 2 decades, thousands of U.S. troops killed, tens of thousands wounded, and trillions of dollars in taxpayer money spent. Iraq also began with promises that the U.S. would not stay long, that it would not be an occupation, and certainly not a war for oil. Yet Iraq revealed a familiar rule: when a government is overthrown without a viable political plan, a power vacuum emerges immediately. That vacuum does not lead to democracy. It leads to violence, armed factions, and ever deeper U.S. military involvement to stabilize the situation. Venezuela is now showing many of the same warning signs seen in Iraq: a vague initial objective, constantly shifting justifications, and above all, a president openly talking about resources, oil, and long-term presence. That is why the Senate vote is not merely a reaction to a specific campaign, but an effort to prevent the U.S. from repeating the Iraq path, a war that began with slogans and ended in an inescapable quagmire. Within the U.S., despite deep social polarization, there remains one rare point of agreement. Both Democratic voters and MAGA voters do not want another endless foreign war, especially a war over oil. That pressure is pushing more Republican lawmakers to openly distance themselves from Trump. Trump understands this, and that is why his response is not policy explanation, but political threats. This is Trump's familiar pattern: personalizing power, personalizing conflict, and turning every disagreement into betrayal. But the problem is not only political, it is legal. Trump's Venezuela strategy is creating serious legal contradictions. On one hand, the Trump administration wants to prosecute Nicolás Maduro, treating him as no longer the legitimate head of state. On the other hand, Trump repeatedly refers to Maduro as the president of Venezuela and even acknowledges working with his apparatus under international law. This can lead to head of state immunity arguments, a loophole large enough to undermine the entire prosecution case. There is also another naive assumption: that U.S. oil corporations will eagerly return to Venezuela's. Reality points in the opposite direction. Producing Venezuelan oil is extremely difficult. Infrastructure is severely degraded. The crude is heavy. Costs are high. Experts estimate that hundreds of billions of dollars in upfront investment would be required, and no corporation is willing to take that risk without long-term security guarantees and massive government subsidies. In other words, if this plan continues, the ultimate cost will fall on U.S. taxpayers. Their tax dollars could be used to subsidize oil companies, while domestic social programs are cut, a familiar paradox in Trump's policy agenda. And at that moment, the biggest question emerges: does Trump actually control the consequences of the decisions he is improvising? Trump has offered no clear long-term plan for Venezuela, no political roadmap, no exit strategy, no congressional consensus, no public support, only a president acting as if war powers are his personal property. The Senate vote, therefore, is not just a legislative maneuver. It is a warning signal, even within Trump's own party. Confidence in his leadership during international crises is collapsing, and Venezuela may well be just the beginning. At home, the incident in Minneapolis involving an ICE agent has sparked major controversy. After a civilian died and the Trump administration was criticized for a confrontational response rather than transparency. At the same time, the Department of Justice continues to delay the release of the Epstein files, reinforcing suspicions of accountability avoidance and political self-protection. When Venezuela, Minneapolis, and Epstein are placed side by side, a common pattern becomes clear. It is Donald Trump's approach to power, personalizing every decision, disregarding oversight mechanisms, and treating the law as a flexible tool, bent when convenient and ignored when inconvenient. Abroad, Trump treats war powers as a personal prerogative, willing to expand intervention without Congress. At home, he uses federal forces in ways that invite confrontation and accepts civilian risk. And in the justice system, he tolerates or directly steers delays in transparency to protect political interests. These are not isolated events. They are a consistent governing style, one that places personal power above institutions, loyalty above law, and political objectives above public safety. That is why the war powers vote in the Senate carries meaning far beyond Venezuela. It shows that, for the first time in a long while, institutions are beginning to push back. Not forcefully, not uniformly, but enough to create a crack. That crack appears at a moment when public trust is under severe strain. When people look outward, they see the risk of a war over oil. When they look inward, they see violence, concealment, and evasion of responsibility. And when both unfold at the same time, the question is no longer which policy is right or wrong, but this: who is actually controlling power? And who is that power being used for? Donald Trump may continue to attack, threaten, and deny. But the reality is that the mechanisms he dismisses still exist. Congress can still vote. States can still investigate. And public opinion, divided as it is, can still recognize repeating patterns. Venezuela is not over. Minneapolis is not closed. The Epstein files have not been fully exposed. But they all raise the same underlying question about the limits of power in a democracy. And that is a question Donald Trump, whether he wants to or not, will continue to face